Welcome to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where we discuss the culture and art of 15th and 16th century Italy. I'm your host, Lawrence Gianangeli. Andiamo avanti. Renaissance people, can you believe that we're on our 50th episode? 50. That is not small potatoes, people. That's a lot of work, let me tell you. And we have covered a lot of ground across these 50 episodes, which actually ranges from works like greats, like Michelangelo, Leonardo, Tullio, Titian, down to minute histories of horror, grand historical moments such as the Pazzi conspiracy. In the episodes before this, we've been working through the development of art in the early Renaissance, from the medieval Gothic style to Masaccio's innovation in painting. We could have continued in this sort of traditional fashion, but since it's our 50th episode, I want to have a deeper conversation about our favorite artist of the Italian Renaissance and one of my personal all-time favorites. So for the 50th episode, we are going to look at a superstar, Donatello. Let me start by saying, please forgive me if I'm a little gravelly, a little congested. I'm coming down with a cold here with the change of the season, so I'm going to try to be my best chipper self as we talk about one of the most significant sculptors of the Italian Renaissance, Donatello. We're coming full circle here, looking back at one of the earliest episodes of the show where I talked about Renaissance sculpture through Donatello's bronze David. I will mention David today. I'll talk a little bit more about David, and although I have a lot more to say about it, I want to look at Donatello more holistically here and give you a look at not all of his work, but the wide range of his work and its significance. So be sure to follow up by revisiting the discussion on his bronze David, if you please. I'm not going to talk about it in full here today. When we look at the history of any medium of art, it's truly impossible to cover all of the artists that are worthy of discussion. So Donatello was born in 1386 and he died in 1466. He had a long and very productive life, and he's emerging alongside these other sculptors that are of absolute noteworthy recognition, such as Lorenzo Ghiberti, Luca della Robbia, and Filippo Brunelleschi, who was also a sculptor. So in my treatment of Brunelleschi, 3 episodes of Brunelleschi, I discussed Ghiberti. I discussed the competition that Brunelleschi and Ghiberti have for the bronze casting of the baptistry doors in Florence, their effort to revive antique sculptural form, and the ultimate outcome of that famous showdown. Namely, Ghiberti is able to produce his famous Gates of Paradise, and Brunelleschi's architectural achievement in constructing the Dome of Florence, the Cupolone. So this is the art historical moment that Donatello is existing in. Still, although we kind of credit Ghiberti in part with some varieties of antique revival, his sculptural work adhered to Gothic aesthetics and is a launching point for Donatello, who's going to radically depart from the Gothic idiom of sculpture that Ghiberti holds to. Well, yes, we are talking about a Florentine artist through and through. Donatello worked for several Renaissance courts across Italy, and he was a master of multiple mediums, which is going to include marble, bronze, and wood, among others. We're actually going to explore one of each, a marble, a wood, and a bronze sculpture today. Donatello's life, though, is not a complete picture, even though there's ample documentation for many of his works. His father, Niccolò di Betto Bardi, was a member of one of the Arte Maggiori, one of the major guilds called the Arte della Lana, the Wool's Guild, one of the most important. That means that not only did Donatello likely grow up with some financial comfort, but he's a member of the Bardi family, a distant member. Think back a few podcast episodes. We talked about the 100 Years' War. We talked about King Edward III defaulting on his loans from major Florentine bankers, the brunt of which impacted 2 families, the Peruzzi and the Bardi, their family banks. It's those very Bardi that Donatello has this distant relation to. Right? His name is Donato di Niccolo di Beto Bardi. Donato, he's called Donatello, right? That's the very Bardi from which comes the famous and lovely Contessina de Bardi, who marries Cosimo de' Medici. That is Cosimo the Elder, the Quattrocento Cosimo, not Duke Cosimo, right? Who also becomes one of Donatello's most revered patrons, protectors, and friends. They're actually buried next to each other, Cosimo de' Medici and Donatello. So, Donatello's family name, Bardi, alongside with his extraordinary talent, may have had some instrumental effect in getting close to the Medici family, because Cosimo married Contessina, and Donatello has a distant relation to her. Still, the Medici were not his only high-profile patrons, as we will see, as we work to actually shift the tides in thinking that the Medici were the only remarkable patrons in the Renaissance. They weren't, right? Especially not for Donatello. As early as the first decade of the 1400s, we know that Donatello worked in Ghiberti's workshop, who's a senior, by the way, by about a decade. So they're contemporaries, but Ghiberti's a little older. Donatello likewise probably spent some time in Rome with Filippo Brunelleschi, studying whatever they from ancient Rome. We have to remember Rome was a swamp, and the ruins were just sort of strewn about everywhere, and guys like Donatello and Brunelleschi were going there to dig and find and study and amplify the sort of effects of All'Antica style in their art that they produced. So Donatello's early work, it earns him some commissions to work on sculpture for the Duomo of Florence, right? They are commissioning sculptors to decorate it. So Donatello is cementing himself among the desirable sculptors of Florence by earning these commissions to work on the most prestigious building in the city. So it is in this moment, we're looking at around 1409, that Donatello completed his Marble David, which is now in the Bargello Museum. The sculpture was likely commissioned for the Duomo, but it was considered actually too small, and it was thus relocated to what is today the Palazzo Vecchio. At the time, it's referred to as the Palazzo dei Priori, the Prior's Palace, which is the city hall from which the Republic was ruled. Of course, as we have discussed, the resonance of David with Florentine civic sentiment as the slayer of tyranny. So in his Marble David, long preceding the bronze one, Donatello shows that he has not quite navigated in 1409 from the Gothic sculptural mode. So David is fully clothed, he has his hand on his hip, and this is how we sort of identify Gothic sculpture one major way, almost like pointed arches in architecture, is called the Gothic sway. The figure has a bit of a bow shape to it, where the hip swings out very far to one side, and the head and the toes sort of have some sort of alignment. So the bow shape of the figure is this stylized motif rather than the naturalistic pose that you get from classical sculpture, the very type of pose that Donatello is going to champion after his Marble David. So it's upon the recognition of his skill that Donatello became involved in the decoration of Or San Michele, which is another one of the most magnificent examples of Renaissance sculpture, because at Or San Michele, one can view the full range of Florentine Quattrocento sculptural achievement, in which masters Donatello, Ghiberti, and then later Verrocchio, and even Giambologna, among many others, all completed one or more niches. These are niche sculptures. They're put into the building. That was commissioned by each of the 14 guilds representing the patron saint of the guild, or sometimes they have more than one, and they choose, right? So looking at this group, the 14 sculptures of Or San Michele, there's actually 15, 16, there's a few because they get replaced, is the best way to examine the differences in sculptural style in the early Renaissance, edging into the high Renaissance, but also among the artists in these periods in the type of work that they're doing. So of these 14 niches, Donatello originally filled 3 of them. This is remarkable. This is important, right? He's going to do 1 for the minor guild of the linaioli and the rigattieri. These are linen workers and second-hand traders, and for them he completed his marble St. Mark around 1415. Between 1422 and 1425 for the Mercanzia Tabernacle, he completes his bronze St. Louis of Toulouse, which is a remarkably strange sculpture. He casts it in several pieces, and it was eventually moved to Santa Croce and replaced by Verrocchio's Doubting Thomas, which is one of my favorite groups of the whole Or San Michele set. That wasn't until the later 15th century. So Verrocchio's sculpting in the 1460s, 70s, and 80s, and he replaces the St. Louis of Toulouse, which gets moved to Santa Croce, okay, and with the bronze Doubting Thomas. And now we come to the star of the show, the third work for San Michele that Michelangelo did, also around 1420. He did this for the Armorers Guild, and that was his marble St. George. I want us to take a closer look at this sculpture. St. George, so his story goes, was from the region of Cappadocia, which is in modern-day Turkey. Although his story did not originate with the author Jacopo della Voragine, we're going to use Voragine's text, the Golden Legend from the 13th century, to construct how St. George was perceived in Renaissance Florence. Very important, guys. The Golden Legend is one of the go-to sources for saints' lives, and it is what we use to sort of tap into what Renaissance artists were looking at, what their rhetors were looking at, what patrons were looking at, because that is sort of the go-to text of saints' lives in the period, right? So first, like most saints, St. George was martyred by Emperor Diocletian for refusing to convert from Christianity. So we have a martyrdom. But unlike many other saints, it's not really his martyrdom that he's primarily associated with, but his legendary and heroic feats in life, which made him a principal military saint and an appropriate emblem for the Guild of Arms and Armor Makers. I'm talking about the legend of St. George and the Dragon. You've heard this story before if you haven't heard it by this very name. How does this story go? A dragon has planted its roots and began to terrorize a village. They stay the dragon's wrath by making offerings, which eventually leads to the dragon taking the princess of the town. It was St. George who came upon the damsel in the dragon's lair. He swore to rescue her in the name of Christ and rode down the dragon with his spear. There's a lot more details, but it is the cliché knight in shining armor saves a damsel in distress from a dragon and slays the dragon. Classic chivalric tale from the Middle Ages with actually ancient precedents. So this is the subject of Donatello's sculpture. Here, let's talk about what's going on in his sculpture of St. George for the Or San Michele niche. We have to look at this work wholly. So the niche itself has Gothic elements. You have the figure embedded in the niche. It's rather shallow with this sort of backdrop of decoration. And then you have the relief sculpture below his feet, the predella sculpture right at his feet. We'll look at both of these. What is going on here? We're really not seeing a Gothic sway anymore. We're seeing St. George in his arms and armor. His proportions are rather classical, okay? While both of his feet are planted firmly, he's not quite in that all'antica contrapposto, but has this shield in front of him, and he's looking out beyond your space. So what is going on here? Yes, the armor itself represents the guild that is the commissioner, the patron of this work, and actually we can tell based on the physical evidence that it was actually equipped with other works of armor that were actually gilded, not marble. So he would have had a helmet and a sword and these sorts of things that were gilded. Metal attachments to the sculpture, they are now lost, okay? But it's really the expression of the figure itself. We have stepped into a new world of naturalism with Donatello here, who has his sort of fingers curling up around the shield that has the Christian cross along it. His hand rests delicately on it. And what is he doing? He's looking past you. And what is he looking at?
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Renaissance people, if you are enjoying the Italian Renaissance podcast, I have good news. We're now active on Patreon. You can show your love for the show by becoming a patron and get access to additional resources, information, and artworks. Better yet, those who join the Renaissance Master or Renaissance Patron tier will get access to at least one additional podcast episode each month. My goal is to ensure that the main podcast remains a free, accessible source for everyone. Become a patron today through the link in the show notes to support the continued production of new episodes and help build and maintain this community. The Italian Renaissance shop is now also active on Etsy, linked in the show notes. Sport our logo or choose from a growing selection of Italian art-inspired designs. Discounts are offered to select Patreon tiers as well. Your support has my immortal gratitude. Now, enjoy the show. The dragon. He's looking at the dragon. What has Donatello done? He has extended the sculptural space into our space by making us imagine what St. George is looking at. That's the dragon. That is in our space, presumably. So we can imagine a sense of unease as we are implicated in this tale. And right below in the predella, in the sculpture, we see that tale from the Golden Legend. Okay, what is he doing? He's on horseback, he's with his spear, and he is riding down the dragon. So Donatello is informing us that we are seeing St. George in two different moments. The full sculpture in the niche, we are seeing him before he mounts his horse and rides down the dragon. So what's going on with his face? He looks concerned, but he stands heroically. He's embedded with fear, uncertainty, but also the valor of a chivalric epic. He is a knight. This damsel is in distress, and he is about to save her by mounting his horse, which is also not included in his sculpture set. We have to assume that horse is nearby, and he is going to ride at this dragon that he's looking at, who is in our space. What is he doing? He is embedding the figure not with just mere representation, but with character. He's given a personality to this sculpture that we are meant to interact with and foresee his victory in light of his doubt. Isn't that rather incredible? Okay, this is not something that is happening often in Renaissance art, specifically not this effectively in such an important and public space. We have to keep in mind, while this is embedded in architecture, it is at the street level. So you can see it as you walk by from the street. You are meant to interact with it as you walk along. What is so important about this is we often credit this moment of implicating outside space of a sculpture with Michelangelo's David. Of course, Michelangelo's David is on the edge of fighting Goliath. He's looking at him. He has his sling in one hand and he's about to throw it and launch it at the giant. But where is Goliath? He's looking off to the right. If you say your right, David's left, Michelangelo's David, because he can see the giant off in the distance, right, on the battlefield. This is right where this originates, in Donatello's St. George, a sculpture that Michelangelo was undoubtedly familiar with. When this sculpture was finished, again, we're talking around 1420, we see that Donatello has developed his own sense of sculptural style that is fully removed from the Gothic and embraces a classical all'antica taste. We soon see from him a variety of the spirit of classical sculpture, namely in his sculpted pulpits, these marble decorative pulpits that go inside of churches or outside of churches for clergy to preach from or to show relics from. These are full of nude, dancing putti. Putti are these little fat cheruby things that come right out of antique sculpture that Donatello sculpts amply. Is that a word? Amply, like a lot of them. He does a lot of them. And he completed one for Santa Stefano in Prato with Cosimo's favorite architect, Michelozzo. That was completed in the 1430s. The reason I mentioned the Prato pulpit is because I live a few minutes away from it. and I want to brag that I get to walk past it all the time. Even though the original is tucked inside of the Cathedral Museum, I have gone to see it. It looks really weird up close in person. You really have to see it below because it's high up on the church facade, and this is where they show the holy girdle of the Virgin Mary that she handed to Thomas before she ascended. So the legend goes. They show that in Prato from this pulpit. The replica is magnificent on the exterior, and which we need to be thankful for, since the Nazis bombed the hell out of Prato in the 1940s. We're very, very lucky that Donatello's pulpit survived. In 1443, Donatello would begin his decade in Padua, but a sculpture exists that has complex dating that I want to talk about that has to do with this Paduan moment, his Penitent Magdalene, Santa Maria Maddalena Penitente, right, which has historically belonged to his late period, his post-Padua period, but conservators and scholars in the last century, are now more inclined to group this work with his pre-Padua work, namely in the late 1430s. Part of the complications in placing this sculpture is that we don't know who it was made for, we don't know why it was made, and we don't know where it originally was placed. It's all unknown. So it might have been for the baptistry in Florence, where it remained until the Great Flood of 1966 and got damaged, but is uncertain. So what is certain is that the raw expressive power of the sculpture, which is made of poplar wood, so we've moved on to a wooden sculpture, right? We were looking at marble, now we're looking at wood. Just a brief note on the 1966 flood. For those of you who don't know, the next time you're in Florence, you'll notice this. The Arno devastated Florence in 1966, and it went in, maybe about 15 feet high. When you come visit Florence, if you look up in some places, especially close to the river, you can see how high the water rose because they put markers on there. The water got all the way to the baptistry and beyond. It flooded the cathedral. It flooded the baptistry where Mary Magdalene was in the center, this wooden sculpture, and it got covered up to about its waist in water. And not just water and mud. And keep in mind, Florence was not so pedestrian in those days. There was a lot of cars. They all got washed away. All of the oil and gasoline got dragged out of them. It covered the streets in oil, gasoline, mud. Okay, so not just a happy little flood of, the Arno's green. It's already kind of like, So the Mary Magdalene was actually exposed to motor oils and things like that from like the waist down, and it's wood. So when they cleaned that, that's when they were able to find certain details like gilding that was below centuries of I don't know what covers wood in centuries, but they had to clean it, and they were able to see new details from it, okay? And it's now in the Opera del Duomo in Florence. Let's look at this incredible work of art, this wooden sculpture of the Penitent Magdalene by Donatello, probably from the 1430s. Here she is. Now we're in contrapposto. But that Renaissance idea of ideal beauty is gone. She is emaciated. She is skin and bones, and you can work out all of the tendons and muscles that are shrunken and malnourished. And of course, Mary Magdalene, she is wearing a drapery, but she is always shown covered in her hair that goes all the way down past her knees. She is pleading for salvation. Her eyes are sunken deep in her head. If you squint, she looks like a skeleton or something out of a horror movie. She really is this awful, emaciated figure. She is an image of the desire for salvation. What is humanity before it is saved? It is this ragged, terrible-looking penitent, on the verge of salvation figure, right? But she's in contrapposto. She has this classical feeling to her, but she's not just representative. We're back to what we saw with St. George. She is a character. We can see the years of suffering, her years in the wilderness. We can see her pain. We can read in those deep eyes, in that open mouth, desire desire for salvation. It has very strong Christian imagery, very strong Renaissance Christian ideology, and we are able to recount her life through the physical and emotional toll that is happening on her physical body. That is the figural sculpture of the wood itself that Donatello masterfully produces for us. This is, I hear it all the time, people who are very familiar with Donatello say the Penitent Magdalene is by far his greatest work of art, because when you see it, you believe it. You believe the moment that Donatello is giving you. This is so far from representational sculpture, Gothic sculpture. This is pure, raw, emotional sculpture with classical precedents. I mean, but not in the Christian way. He's able to take this Christian icon and plant it onto a classical motif and then embed it with pure reality. It is striking. So if we're thinking about that in the 1430s, we followed Donatello into stardom in Florence, which led him to doing his work in Padua, right? Being called there by the family of the famed condottiere named Gattamelata, the honeyed cat, right? Really, his name was Erasmo de Nari. He was dead at this point, but just so you all know, a condottiere is a type of militia leader. They were quite revered in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. These were the men who led bands of militants who would be hired by republics and dukedoms and all these things and serve in their army. So I call to your attention the sculpture, one of the most important things that Donatello did in Padua, his equestrian monument to the condottiere Gattamelata, because it had a significant landmark importance in the history of sculpture. To our modern eyes, in the West, equestrian sculpture is everywhere. However, while Donatello is not the first to do it in Italy since antiquity, here is the first monument in Padua. We see the first rendering of an equestrian figure on a monumental scale in the likeness of antiquity. High levels of naturalism, but also antique reference. That means he's looking at and familiar with not only the famed equestrian Marcus Aurelius in Rome in the Capitoline Museum, one of the most important antique sculptures that actually, believe it or not, remained on view throughout the Middle Ages. They just thought it was Constantine. But he's also looking at the San Marco Quadriga in Venice, those famous Byzantine bronze horses that Venice looted from Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade in 1204. He has a contemporary model as well. Back in Florence, a fresco by the very important painter Paolo Uccello inside of the Duomo shows a painted monumental equestrian. So this is not a sculpture, it's not a bronze sculpture, it's a fresco, to the English condottiere named Sir Jonathan Harkwood, who was involved with Florence's struggles against Milan in the 1390s. So he has a painted funerary monument in the Duomo of Florence, in the cathedral, by Paolo Uccello, that is very classicizing. It looks like a classical equestrian monument. So, with these models in mind, we see Donatello achieve for the first time in monumental bronze since antiquity a highly lifelike representation of a figure on horseback in military glory like a Roman emperor. Donatello embeds the figure with movement and, again, character. I want to say there are equestrian monuments and sculpture that come before the Gattamelata in Padua, but they are not really, they're sort of stiff. The horse legs are sort of flat on the ground. They don't have this high level of technical achievement. It's the way that Donatello fuses the antique, the Roman, the Byzantine, and a contemporary reference into a single figure, and the massive technical skill that is involved in casting such a gigantic figure in bronze that makes this such a celebrated and important work. And it was finished in 1453. From this time, an entire school of artists emerged following Donatello, which forever changed the art of northern Italy. Donatello had a very important impact in Padua. That is the point of this, with the equestrian sculpture of the Gattamelata. Renaissance people, we've looked at 3 major works by Donatello, among others, in 3 different mediums. We looked at a marble, we looked at a wood, and we looked at a bronze. And I hope this helps us understand the scope and impact of Donatello's work and innovations. As for his bronze David, it falls into this unknown date range of the 1440 to 1460, possibly being finished before he left for Padua, possibly upon his return. Briefly, I just want us to recall that the Bronze David is the first full-scale bronze nude since antiquity and is among the most important works of the early Renaissance. It is the revival of the antique nude in monumental sculpture. Again, I discussed this in full in a previous episode, but I want to use Bronze David to conclude here. It is in the same way that antiquity appealed to other major aspects of society, such as the military memorial, the heroic saint. The Bronze David informs about a sensual aspect of antiquity that was revived through the diligent study of the nude body. Remember my story about the homoerotic feather, okay? Not quite right, but it's important for us not to overlook that Donatello, since we're looking at the story of his life, was likely a sodomite. And I mean that in period terms, since we can't really adequately project modern identity terms into the past, such as homosexual. It serves very little to say whether he was a homosexual or bisexual or he never married, right? There's no record of him pursuing female romance, but he was at least a sodomite, known to be a sodomite. That means he preferred men as romantic partners or physical partners, as was well known in the period, to act on that preference. Right? So now we can read that in his art through Bronze David, but also in writings of the 15th century, albeit that came slightly after his death, and through the intense archival studies on Florentine sodomite activity, which show that it was very much a public and accepted mode of Florentine life, and it was often defended, the defense of male-to-male love, from the Neoplatonic humanists who were sort of ruling the upper-class intellectual movements of the Renaissance. I mean to say that while David cannot solely provide us with more than speculation about Donatello's personal life, it would not have been a hidden, subversive practice, even though the sculpture was a remarkable first, but a known practice, his sodomite activity, that could have simply come with some minor legal penalties if reported. That's sort of how it went. It is even possible that Cosimo de' Medici protected the sodomites in his court, of which it appears there were at least a few, and he was particularly fond of Donatello. How fond, I cannot say. Beyond his romantic preferences, Donatello is likely known to be rather cynical and even charitable. There's a text known as the Diary of Poliziano, the same author who probably provides the gossip of Donatello's sodomite activity, the same author who was a sodomite himself, said that when Donatello had given money to a poor man one time, he said it was, quote, this is a supposed quote of Donatello, "not for the love of God, but because you need it." Right? So charity itself was a practical matter, among other things, for him. Guys, 50 episodes done, my dear listeners, and I could do another 50 just on Donatello, his personality, his works, his large body of sculpture, but this is where I close the book on Donatello. I am so happy to have done this with you all, and I hope for another 50 episodes, but I can only do that with your support. So remember to follow us on all of our platforms, support us on our Patreon, and leave ratings, reviews, but most importantly, keep listening to the podcast. I hope I did Donatello justice today, and I hope you'll continue to listen on to episode 51 in 2 weeks' time. I want to thank you all for listening, and until next time, arrivederci.